From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The FBI releases new crime statistics for 2022 that show a drop in violent offenses. But do those national averages blur the story of which states are succeeding at ensuring public safety and which states are not? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The Federal Bureau of Investigation last week released its 2022 Crime in the Nation statistics. The Bureau says that this is data on more than 11 million criminal offenses reported to the Uniform Crime Reporting Program. I will cite just a representative example of how this news was discussed in the media. The Associated Press headline says, FBI report violent crime decreases to pre-pandemic levels, but property crime is on the rise. And as usual with statistics like this, it is hard to get national numbers at a perfect rate of compliance. But according to the AP report, the FBI says this new data represents 83% of police agencies, covering about 94% of the U.S. population. And the overall results are that violent crime is down 1.7%, including a 6.1% drop in murder and non-negligent manslaughter, but robbery up 1.3%, aggravated assaults down 1.1%, and overall these violent crime numbers get the U.S. back to the level of violent crime that we saw prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But Alicia, the Journal had a fascinating editorial going deeper into the statistics in two states, California and Florida. And it makes the argument that these kinds of national numbers miss a big part of the story of what is happening on the ground. So why don't you give us that argument?
So what you actually see when you drill down is that the violent crime and property crime rates in both states actually start to diverge during the pandemic in 2020 or so. In California, for example, the violent crime rate has increased by about 13% since 2019, while it has actually declined by 31.5% in Florida. And when you look at the property crime is actually down by about 27% since 2019, while in California, it's purportedly up by just 0.3%. I'll add this caveat that in California and probably some other places, property crime is probably underreported because the state has effectively decriminalized a lot of offenses like shoplifting and larceny. That is kind of like petty theft. By petty, they mean less than $950 worth of merchandise stolen. And that's, again, per offense. So as an aside, all those people smash and grabs, the criminals, if they stole less than $950 from Nordstrom's and then stole less than $950 worth of things from another retailer, they could continue and it would still be only classified as a misdemeanor. All this is a way of saying that in California, the property crime levels are probably underreported. Florida, perhaps to some extent too, but not as much so as California. So the divergence in the crime rates is probably a lot bigger than the FBI is reporting. And I think what you're really seeing is you're seeing in other states. Actually, New York saw a big increase in its violent crime rate this last year in 2022 as well. And some of this actually puts data to a lot of the anecdotes that we read in the press. And again, like Governor Gavin Newsom will say, oh, that's just anecdotes, isn't data, as they say. But this is hard data and actually shows that the trends and the things that we are reading about and hearing about in the news. There has been an increase in crime in California and in these big cities like San Francisco and LA, and much less so in places like Tampa and Miami.
I would encourage listeners to go look up the line graphs that come in the Journal's editorial on this. The headline is DeSantis versus Newsom on violent crime. And the charts there give both violent crime and property crime rates for California, Florida, and the United States for a decade, from 2012 to 2022. And there are two things that stand out to me. One is that it seems that Florida was not immune from the trend in 2020 during the COVID lockdowns, during the George Floyd protests, a backlash against police. Violent crime also went up in Florida. But the real divergence happens after that, when it drops precipitously in Florida to about 260 violent crimes per 100,000 people in 2022. And in the meantime, it was going up in California almost 500 per 100,000 people, so almost double the rate in Florida. And the trend in property crime is similar, but not so pronounced. In 2022, it was about 2,300 property crimes per 100,000 population in California versus about 1,600 for Florida. But the key in these charts, Kim, is the divergence. It's when these two lines are kind of tracking pretty closely together, and then in a year or two, they go in opposite directions at a 45 or a 60 or a 90-degree angle. That's what really catches my eye, and I think does suggest that there are policy differences in these states that are contributing. It is not just that crime is a matter of broader social trends. It obviously is, but it also plays out in the context of what these individual states are doing.
Oh, absolutely. It entirely comes down to policy because, as you note, the entire country was rocked in 2020 by protests and backlashes to the lockdowns, obviously the George Floyd aftermath, followed by the defund the police movement, which really picked up steam around the country. And everybody suffered from the crime that happened from that. It's at that point that the policies and the people charged with enforcing the policies then become the deciding factor. Because let's also be clear that it isn't necessarily that Florida has much tougher laws. I mean, there are some examples, as Alicia noted, where California has made a dreadful error of decriminalizing certain offenses. But when you get to things like violent crime, I mean, no one is supposed to be able to engage in violent crime, whether in Florida or California. So what accounts for the difference in those extraordinary numbers? And obviously, a huge part of it are liberal prosecutors, people like George Gascon in Los Angeles, or Chesa Boudin, who was recalled, don't forget, in 2022 by San Francisco voters. This is one of the most liberal electorates in the country. But this prosecutor, Chesa Boudin, had eliminated cash bail, essentially allowed a revolving door of criminals. His goal was to empty prisons. And, by the end of his tenure, you even had members of the Liberal Board of Supervisors in San Francisco and the Democratic County Central Committee among those voting that he should be removed from office because crime had become so bad and because nothing would be done about it. And of course, one of the problems here is that it's also a vicious downward spiral in that the less prosecutors will enforce the law and put people in jail, the more demoralized the police get about trying to arrest anyone because they see it as a revolving door. There's no point of going out and risking their lives to buck up a criminal who's just going to be put back out on the streets the next day. And you see that obviously in the increasingly brazen videos of the smash and grabs, but also the property crimes that Alicia was talking about, which there's been an enormous jump, 31% jump in auto thefts in California since 2019. And one of my favorite stories doesn't get enough attention, but I note it because I've actually been a victim of this crime. But people also stealing pieces off of cars, the catalytic converter theft rampage that continues to go on. This is a little piece of your car that deals with pollution control, but it's got a lot of valuable parts inside of it. So people come and cut it off the bottom of your car that can sell it on the black market for up to $1,000 a piece. The state of California accounted for 37% of all catalytic converter theft claims in the country in 2022, with 1,600 stolen a month. And that just tells you something about the general attitude in California. If you are engaged in thievery and you believe no one's going to come after you, those numbers are just going to skyrocket. And that's what you're seeing. And that's a huge part of the divergence between a state like California, where the prosecutors are just letting all of this happen and things are spiraling out of control, versus Florida, where prosecutors have cracked down and managed to reinforce the message that disorder and law breaking is going to be punished and not tolerated.